I am delighted to welcome Ambassador Peter Galbraith for the annual Galbraith Lecture. I want to say thank you, first of all, to Brooks Memorial Library for providing this wonderful space that's so much fun to talk in. My name is Claire Gillis. I am also a member of the Windham World Affairs Council Board, and I am here to introduce our most well-known council member, Peter Galbraith. Ambassador Galbraith recently returned from Ukraine and Moldova, and he will speak to us today about the war's implications for Ukraine, for Russia and Putin, for the peace of Europe, and for our ability to meet existential global challenges like climate change. He'll consider the danger that Russia might use nuclear weapons and how the world might respond. And finally, he'll discuss possible outcomes and settlements. There are few American diplomats who've had as much direct experience in wartime diplomacy as Ambassador Galbraith. As the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, he negotiated the 1995 peace agreement that ended that country's war. He was also part of the team that negotiated the Dayton Peace Accords for Bosnia. Personally, I'm very curious to hear about crisis diplomacy, which is a phrase I heard on the radio the other day, and it seems to be a point in time we might be reaching in Ukraine, if not already well there. In the course of working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he became closely acquainted with then Senator, now President of the country, Joseph R. Biden, he was on the front lines of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq war, the Sri Lanka Civil War, the First Gulf War, and the 1991 Kurdish uprising. His last diplomatic posting was as an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations in Afghanistan. In recent years, he's been a regular visitor to northeast Syria, where he advises the Syrian Democratic Forces on negotiation strategy, and separately is reuniting Yazidi women kidnapped by ISIS with their children who were born as the result of sexual violence. In addition to his vast international work, he's maintained strong ties to his home state of Vermont throughout his life. He served 2 terms as a Vermont state senator from Windham County from 2011 to 2015, and he was a candidate for governor of Vermont in 2016. He's the author of 2 critically acclaimed books on the Iraq War and has published in a wide array of news outlets, including the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. He was also an assistant professor of international relations and economics at Windham College in Putney, Vermont, from 1975 to 1978, and he was professor of national security strategy at the National War College in 1999 and between 2001 and 2003. The annual Galbraith Lecture honors his father, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist who authored more than 30 books, including The Affluent Society. This Galbraith was a public intellectual who believed the economy should work to fulfill the needs of the people. And a brief word about Windham World Affairs Council. We celebrated our 60th anniversary last fall, and it's part of the National World Affairs Councils of America, and it relies entirely on the support of membership and membership dues and donations from those who attend our events. WWAC holds a monthly 4th Wednesday board meeting from 5 to 6 p.m. and a members and friends salon 6 to 7 p.m. at 118 Elliott in Brattleboro. And the WWAC encourages you very much, especially if you enjoy these events, to join us. You can find information online at our website, windhamworldaffairscouncil.org. And before I turn over the stage to Ambassador Galbraith, just some housekeeping notes. The talk will be followed by a Q&A. In the room, we'll have some circulating microphones, so obviously you can do the thing with raising your hands. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with it. If you are watching at home on Zoom and have a question, please put it in the Q&A function. If you put it in the chat function, we might miss it. But you should feel free to use the chat function to chat with each other. And in the Q&A function, if there's really a lot of questions going on, you can also feel free to upvote questions so that you're sure that we'll get to them. And a reminder to silence your telephones immediately, please. Any other devices you might have on your person. This is the first reminder. It is friendly. Any further reminders might be less so. There are refreshments for people who got here early, and if those people left anything for the rest of us, you can get some after the show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador Peter Galbraith back to Brattleboro. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for that extremely generous introduction with, a lot of successful things, except possibly for that business about running for governor. But anyhow, and it's that's true. But it's really great to be back here. The Windham World Affairs Council, I periodically help out the Harvard Alumni Association by giving lectures on trips, cruises, that sort of thing. In another environment, it might be called a junket. But in any event, on one of these, there was the head of the World Affairs Council. And so we got to talking about the Windham World Affairs Council, which is the smallest World Affairs Council in the country. It might be the only one that's all volunteer. And it's just an extraordinary testament to this community, which is a fairly small community of people who are so engaged on the important issues of the day. And this has also been a favorite of our family. My father certainly gave one of the very first lectures to the World Affairs Council. It was founded in 1962. He was ambassador to India, so almost certainly it was in the summer of 1963. I vaguely remember coming. I certainly came to different ones, including here at a later time in the Brooks Library, and then I've been doing this now, well, for something like 28 years, and my brother's done a few, so it's possible that Galbraith's, there have been at least 60 lectures over the 60 years. So thank you for putting up with us. I want to talk, obviously, about the war in Ukraine, in part because, as somebody who grew up and went through the Cold War, and through this extraordinary moment when the Cold War ended. If you grew up, as I'm afraid most of the people in this room have the same memories, of a time when nuclear Armageddon hung over us. And then all of a sudden it ended, and then there was this great moment of liberation and liberalism as communism fell, as democracy took hold. And, we seemed to be looking for the promise of a more peaceful era. And for a time, that was really true. Yes, there was the Saddam invading Kuwait, but that was dealt with rather effectively and rather quickly. There was the Bosnia War, which obviously was something, the Croatia and Bosnia wars, that engaged me. But, this was in small places. But it's hard not to feel discouraged when you have a war of this scale with all the risks that are attended to it, at a time when there seemed to be so much hope. And as the title of the talk says, the other problem is we're dealing with a kind of, 19th, 20th century issue of, one country invading another. And as a result, we're not addressing the many problems that we face, including or not addressing as effectively as we could, this existential problem of climate change. But many of the other challenges that we face on the planet. So anyhow, let me begin by, I was, as Claire said, in Ukraine and Moldova in September. I'd also been in Moldova in May and June, talking to them because, and I'll talk a little bit about Moldova because it's obviously one of the most threatened places by what is going on. A little picture from my summer trip to Odessa, but this is the great landmark of Odessa. It's the Opera House, and the operas were starting the day after I was there, but you can see it's sort of sandbagged. And these were just some scenes, again, in Odessa, a place that was a target, but as the Russians didn't, have not succeeded, a great deal of life was returning to normal there. The statue is of Catherine the Great, who founded Odessa, and there's or under whose regime Odessa was founded, and there is a considerable movement there to remove the statue. And the train station, there are soldiers that are off heading to the front lines. But it isn't actually very far from Kherson and Mykolaiv and the front lines. And again, the picture on the left is on the right, is of the Archaeological Museum. And this is the kind of thing that I saw happen in Croatia and was happening in Odessa, as they are boxing up the treasures so that they are not damaged. I mean, this is, again, what happened, this is really shades of 1939. Exactly this kind of scene, and then just a street. I wanted to just give you just a few images of what was going on. This is a little map of where things stood on March 6th. So at the beginning of the Russian invasion, the invasion began on the 24th, and there was clearly an expectation on the part of the Russians of very quick victory. They launched a column from Belarus, which is a puppet state, that got very, very close to the outskirts of Kyiv, taking the airport, not the main airport, but a subsidiary airport, and Bucha and Irpin. And then also getting right around Kharkiv and moving to take, again, right at the beginning, the territory north of Crimea. So Kherson, which is the only provincial capital that the Russians have actually successfully taken, and Melitopol. Then, of course, right on the Sea of Azov was Mariupol, which was subject to, the same kind of bombardment that Berlin was subject to in 1945, and just left in ruins. So that was the situation then. And the expectation on the part of the Russians and on the part of many Western analysts, I have to say myself included, was that the Russians would prevail quickly, that there would be continued resistance, guerrilla resistance, but that it would be a quick victory. But there's a point that I've made in the previous lecture, which is that wars very rarely go as their architects intend. We learned that repeatedly. I've given a lot of lectures on the Iraq War, making that point. And then there's a second lesson here, which is militaries are most powerful the day before they're used. And of course, what happened? The Russians had a lot of very unmotivated conscripts, equipment that had not been properly maintained, that broke down, that was sabotaged, and they encountered, and this is almost always the case, the wars have unexpected events, unintended consequences. They encountered a Ukrainian resistance that was really fierce and determined. And so, in that sense, it was something very unexpected. So I think going back to the beginning, it's worth discussing what was it that Russia was trying to do, and why did Putin do this? How did this happen? So that what the previous slide showed where things were at the beginning of in March, but this one shows where things are today. And as you can see, looking at the purple area, a significant amount of territory, particularly around Kharkiv, has been recovered by Ukraine. In fact, the Russians withdrew their forces that had penetrated close to Kyiv. The area around Kherson is contested. And a little more detail then at Kherson, where there's an offensive that's going on now. Again, the Russians have evacuated the population from Kherson. They're digging in, but there is a belief that they may lose the city. And what's particularly significant about Kherson is that if you look carefully at the map, you'll see the river, the Dnipro River. Kherson is on the west bank, and there are a couple of bridges. And if the bridges are destroyed, then the Russian forces in Kherson could be trapped there. So Kherson is both a place where they may wish to make a stand, it's a place where they're vulnerable of being trapped. And then in the east, this is, and again around Kharkiv and east of Kharkiv is where the Ukrainians have made their most significant gains. That said, a large part of Ukraine remains under Russian occupation. So anyhow, here a picture of the protagonists of Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin of Russia. So what was it that Putin? What were his calculations? What was he trying to do? Now, let me dispel one myth or one argument. This had nothing to do with NATO enlargement. The reality was there was no chance that Ukraine, or for that matter Georgia, were ever going to be admitted to NATO. Why? Because it would have required the 30 members of NATO to commit to the defense of the territory of those countries, when in fact Crimea, part of the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, was under Russian control and had been, illegally annexed. An area in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk, was held by Russian-backed rebel Ukrainians and Russian forces. So the notion that and remember, any one of the 30 could veto the membership, that all 30 were going to sign up to a military mission to defend Ukraine just wasn't going to happen. And the same story about Georgia, where parts of the territory are held by Russian-backed breakaway states. It wouldn't have gotten 2/3 of the vote in the United States Senate prior to February 24th. So that, and incidentally, Putin clearly knew that. I mean, this was just a bogus argument. Now, I'm going to say that, and we could spend a lot of time on this, that the United States has made mistakes in its handling of relations with Russia, particularly over Ukraine. In 2008, at the Bucharest NATO summit, the communique, which was written by the outgoing Bush administration, had an invitation for Ukraine and Georgia to join. An invitation for something that was never going to happen. in my view, that's not a wildly responsible thing to do. It served only to provoke. And then in 2014, in the Obama administration, when there were demonstrations in Kyiv against the duly elected Russian-backed leader, the United States made statements that were simply ended up being provocative. But that in itself is it's no justification for the invasion of Ukraine, and it's not a reason for the invasion of Ukraine. I might add, on the subject of NATO enlargement, of course, NATO wasn't going to be enlarged by adding Ukraine or Georgia. Turns out it is going to be enlarged by adding 2 countries, Finland and Sweden. So what was it that was motivating Putin? It's hard for me to, one can only speculate. But the trouble is, anytime you've held the same job for 21 years, it gets a little boring. Really. And especially if you're getting to, be about 70. I mean, I know that's where I am. You're thinking of your legacy. So I think a great deal of this was that not to recreate the Soviet Union. The last thing that Putin would want would be to include a lot of Muslims from Central Asia. He's a Russian nationalist. But it was his vision of a greater Russia. Basically, the view that the Belarusians, white Russians, they're not really different, and the Ukrainians are not really different. Anyhow, about 40% of the Ukraine's population are, including incidentally Zelensky, their native tongue is Russian. So I think that his basic idea, his basic hope was to take all of Ukraine. I don't think he was thinking about, just the areas that he's now talking about. He thought that the Ukrainian regime Ukrainian government would collapse, and that he therefore, he obviously recognized there'd be a strong international reaction, but it would be a fait accompli, and he would have been the man who created Greater Russia. There's another element of this. One of the things I've learned in my career is that the first victim of propaganda is always the propagandist. They come to believe their own arguments. And so Putin argued that the Ukrainians, and as he said in his speech on the eve of the invasion, that the Ukrainians are not a people. Ukraine is not a state. That may sound like propaganda to us, but I think it's actually what he believes. He said that the Russians in Ukraine didn't want to be part of Ukraine. They wanted to be a part of Russia. Why? Because they're Russian speakers. And therefore they're Russians, not Ukrainians. And that they were being oppressed. I don't know how far he believed that Ukraine was being run by that rare breed of Jewish Nazis. Maybe that was something he knew wasn't true, but maybe he persuaded himself of it too. And I think the other thing is that if you're a long-time leader, you begin to see yourself as having superior wisdom, and this is of course fed by all the people who are working for you. And now I'm going to share a bit of just a couple of videos that I think illustrate the difference between Putin, the guy who's been there for almost 22 years, December 31st, 1999, and Zelensky, who had been president for a couple of years, whose previous job was as a comedian. And he was the star of a series like Netflix. Actually, I'm not sure how it was shown, called Servant of the People, which was about a school teacher, a high school teacher, who is so fed up with the corruption that, thinking he's in a private moment, goes on a tirade, a profanity-laden tirade against the corrupt leaders of Ukraine. What he doesn't see is that one of his students is filming him with a smartphone, and that student posts the film, or the video, on the internet, on Instagram or something, and it goes viral, all over Ukraine. And then the students have a GoFundMe page, and they collect the money for Zelensky to run for the teacher, to run for president, and then he wins. This is the movie. Well,
таким образом согласился бы с предложением Николая Платоновича о том, что нашим, так сказать, западным партнерам можно дать последний шанс с тем, чтобы предложить им в кратчайшие сроки заставить Киев пойти на мир и выполнить Минские соглашения. В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится.
Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет.
А я
говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да? Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Да, мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
But what's extraordinary about that video is not only that is he humiliating the head of foreign intelligence, one of the people in his inner circle, not only the visual of a leader far away from his inner circle, but that they broadcast it. I mean, what was the message in doing that? And now, by contrast, the Ukrainian president. A little clip from Servant of the People.
Hello?
Good morning, Mr. Galbraith. Can I connect you with Angela Merkel?
Yes, you can connect.
Hello. My congratulations. We decided to take your country to the European Union.
Oh, fuck! Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wow! Oh, I'm so happy. Yes. Thank you very much. All the Ukrainians and all of our country. We've been waiting for this so much time.
Ukrainians?
Yes, Ukrainians.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's a mistake. I was calling to Montenegro.
Montenegro. I see. Okay. Yeah, my congratulations. Yes, to Montenegro. Bye bye. Fuck! You fucking Montenegro. Что?
Well, I mean, you couldn't have a bigger contrast between two leaders than in those two video clips. And of course, Zelensky then ran for president of Ukraine for real. And what was his political party called? Servant of the People. And I think you could see why he's been so effective. But again, the extraordinary mentality of Putin, not only humiliating the head of the SVR in the meeting, but then putting this on television. All right. I want to, let me, oops. Let me just run through this for a second. This is basically Putin's idea that part of the reasons he believed that Ukrainians would in fact, particularly in the East, would welcome Russia because, in fact, it is in the East and in the south around Odessa is where the Russian-speaking Ukrainians prevail. And you can see this, it also tracks very closely to the political map of Ukraine in the elections in earlier in this century. So in the 2004 elections, again, the Russian-speaking areas are voting for the Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, and the Ukrainian-speaking areas are voting for Yushchenko, who won in the Ukrainian-speaking areas. In 2010, however, again, the same pattern on the map, but the Yanukovych won, the pro-Russian leader, and he was the one then that was ousted in 2014, and that event led Putin's decision both to annex Crimea and to support or to launch the insurgencies in Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, let me also say a word why I think this war is so important. The first reason is that the entire post-1945 world system, a system that, in spite of all the wars we've had, has given us a period in our lifetimes of peace that is unprecedented. What the 1945 settlement, as embodied in the UN Charter, and it's, to be honest, nothing that the UN has done. It is the fact that the UN exists. I mean, the UN has done good things, but the fact that it exists. That system is, you cannot invade the internationally recognized territory of another country and hope to be able to conquer and annex it. If you think about it, it was the desire of countries to invade and annex territory of other countries that was the major source of war for centuries up until 1945. After 1945, that stops. Now, there have been wars, India and Pakistan, but over disputed territory, not over internationally recognized territory. And let's be clear, the entire world, including Russia, recognized the borders of Ukraine when it became, when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. You've had ideological wars. The American war in Vietnam, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the American war in Afghanistan, the American war in Iraq. But they were not about annexing territory. They were about defeating communism, or in the case of the Soviets in Afghanistan, preserving communism, or trying to bring democracy to Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. But it was not about conquering the countries, or I would argue even taking the resources. The one exception after 1945, and again, this is when you're internationally recognized, you're a member of the UN. The one exception was Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. which he then annexed as the 19th province of Iraq. And that one ended very badly for Iraq and for Saddam Hussein, so it strengthened the system. The first case then is Putin taking Crimea in 2014, and then in 2022 trying to take, I would argue, all of Ukraine. So that's a really important principle to preserve. I mean, the whole idea of the United Nations, at its root, it's a collective security agreement. One country attacks another, and the rest of the world supports the country that's being attacked and gangs up on the country that's doing the attacking, and therefore the country's deterred from attacking. Now, that system is much harder to maintain when the country that is violating that 1945 system is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, one of the 5 internationally recognized nuclear powers. The second reason why the Ukraine war is very important is the danger that that NATO itself could be drawn in. In other words, that it could escalate, because after all, Ukraine is on the, both Ukraine and Russia are on the border of NATO countries. And third is the risk that it will become nuclear, and I'll come back to that. So what are the prospects for the war? What was expected to be a short war is now lasted 8 months, and it's heading into both the muddy fall and winter, so there's some thought that things will stabilize. It's turned out to be very bloody. Of course, there are no agreed figures on the casualties, but just to cite this, the civilian casualties, according to the United Nations, are 6,430 killed and about 10,000 wounded. In some ways, now we know that these figures are low, but given all the violence, actually, to me, it's strikingly low figures. The Ukrainian government asserts that they've lost about 10,000 killed and 30,000 wounded. The Russians assert that they've killed 61,000 Ukrainians. On the case of the Russian forces, the U.S. and the U.K. estimate combined casualties, killed and wounded, of about 80,000, which is a big percentage of the 200,000 that went in there. It's about a third. The Russians, of course, have much lower figures on killed. If you look at confirmed deaths, it's about 8,000, and the Russians themselves say it's 6,000. But you know, from various sources, you know the names of at least 8,000. So that's one thing, is that this has been a very long and bloody war. Second, it looks like it's, and incidentally has been accompanied by extraordinary brutality in terms of, you know, war crimes committed against Ukrainian citizens in a whole range of places. You know, the first case was Bucha. The second factor in this war has been the response of the international community, and particularly the United States. The United States has authorized $40 billion in support of Ukraine. About $16 billion has been spent so far. The European Union has spent about $6 billion, and beyond that, Germany $1 billion, France $1 billion, and UK $1.5 billion. This is representing the both direct cash, humanitarian aid, but most of all, it is the value of military equipment that is being provided to the Ukrainians. I would observe that you know, if you compare this to the much more expensive U.S. ventures in Afghanistan, about $2 trillion, or Iraq, $4 trillion, this is both much less money and much more effective. And I think the big takeaway, I would say, is there are no Americans fighting in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we are supporting the Ukrainians in the defense of their own country. Whereas in Iraq and Afghanistan, we came in with our forces and imposed our ideals of what the result should be, with the obviously disastrous result in Afghanistan last year, and not a great success in Iraq either, except in the one part of the country where we didn't go in, which is Kurdistan. So that, I think there's a lesson there in terms of how we do our interventions. That amount of military equipment, combined with the poor morale of the Russians, the motivation of the Ukrainians, has actually, although Russia's much larger, has actually shifted the battlefield in favor of the Ukrainians. There's one other factor here, which is one of the reasons that Russia's forces are degraded is that they cannot get, that their high-tech weapons require electronics components that are not produced in Russia. They have to be imported. And since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, now they've been under sanctions. So on the one hand, the Ukrainians are getting very increasingly sophisticated weapons from the United States and Germany and France. And on the other hand, the Russians are using up those weapons. So there are a couple of clouds on the horizon from the Ukrainian point of view. One of them will take place in the United States in 5 days. I think it's almost certain that the Republicans will take the House of Representatives. Speaker McCarthy, or the Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, who will be the next speaker, has explicitly said that they are not prepared to continue this level of support for Ukraine. So that has to be a question. I don't know how the Biden administration will respond. I think the way the Biden administration has handled this has been extremely good. It has been balancing the desire not to escalate things too far with providing increasing levels of support to the Ukrainians as they're able to use it. So what happens when next year, when the Republicans take over at least one House of Congress, I don't know. It may be that we'll have some big supplemental while the Democrats still are in charge before the end of the year, and that it can be spent out. Now, it's important to talk about the risks in this conflict. And I would say that the biggest risk in the conflict is that Russia may use a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon. I think we'd all say it's illogical. It would break a taboo that's been in place for 77 years. It risks a huge escalation of the conflict. But one thing is, Putin keeps talking about it, although helpfully recently he said he wouldn't do it. One of the things you have to keep in mind is if somebody's talking about something, there's a good chance, there's at least some chance they're actually going to do it. And this is the first conflict in the nuclear age where nuclear weapons have been used at least, excuse me, as a form of blackmail. I think it would be catastrophic because you'll be breaking the taboo that's existed for 77 years. And the last thing that we want is for nuclear weapons to be thought of as another form of weapon. Anyhow, and then the question is, what does the U.S. do in response if that happens? Now, clearly, we won't use nuclear weapons. There's some discussion. David Petraeus, General Petraeus, has said, well, then we should use our conventional forces, in other words, get directly involved to attack Russian forces in Ukraine. But that risks further escalation. And so, maybe it is what one should do because you shouldn't give in to nuclear blackmail. On the other hand, whatever happens, we don't want to blow up the entire world. So it's a challenge as to how you respond. Clearly, the response will not be nuclear, but what kind of response is a very difficult calculation. And at least I, who usually have all sorts of good ideas, and not that people listen to them the way they should, I really don't know here. The second area of risk, I would say, is Crimea. There has to be a point at which Russia a point at which Putin really would be in a corner, and I think if the war continues as the Ukrainians would like, and as they're obviously legally entitled, into Crimea, that risks again a Russian escalation, and their main form of escalation might well be nuclear. So those are the main risks, and then it just shows where the NATO forces are and balance of forces. So let me. I'm not going to. In the interest of having some questions, I'm going to just go to the question of how does this end? Well, I think Putin's control is not what it appears to be. Putin is not Stalin. And I think there's all sorts of evidence for this. Perhaps the best evidence is that when he announced conscription, a mobilization, what happened? About 200,000 Russians, men, left the country. I believe that the total number of men who left the United States during the Vietnam War was in the neighborhood of 10 to 20,000. This was 200,000 in a few days. You also, and I know from talking to my Russian friends, they are dismayed by what's going on. And incidentally, they aren't killing people far away who don't look like them. They're killing people right next door. And the part of Russia, of Ukraine they're hitting is the part of Ukraine, if you remember that map, that is inhabited by Russians. And there are all sorts of family connections. So you have to imagine, well, first there is various forms of dissent, but you have to imagine a lot of people have doubts about it. Now, almost every war is popular on the day it begins. But they become much less popular as it goes on, particularly if it's going on badly and you have the bodies coming home. Then there's the question of Putin's team. If you looked at that video of Sergei Naryashkin, you think that he was actually enthusiastic about the idea of invading Ukraine? If you looked at Lavrov, who's been the foreign minister and therefore socialized in the entire international system, he's been foreign minister for, I think, anyhow, more than a decade. He's been a big defender of Putin in this. Does he really believe it? I doubt it. I suspect that many of the people around Putin don't believe it. Now, they're careerists. The president's decided they believe in the system. They're going to do their duty. But it's one thing for people to do their duty in something they believe in, and another thing to do their duty in something that they know is wrong. And I suspect a lot of people know that this is wrong. And then, what happens if Putin gets into a corner? How much of the people on his team are likely to be in his corner? Do you think, again, that Sergei Naryashkin is going to be there putting his body between Putin and the guy who's coming for him? I don't think so. So that's a factor there. And finally, and this is one of the problems, but the worst thing that any strong man can do, dictator, is launch a war and lose it. Not only does your term in office end badly, but you end badly. Let me give a few examples. In 1974, the Greek junta decided it would be a great idea to overthrow the government in Cyprus of Makarios and install a guy who wanted unity with Greece. Turkey responded about 6 days later by invading, taking over 40% of the island, which they still occupy, and the junta fell. And I think it was just last year that the last of the members of the junta died in prison. In 1982, the Argentine junta, which had a huge amount of blood on its hands, so did the Greek junta, decided to take the Falklands. That ended badly. And again, in this decade, the last of the members of the Argentine junta died in prison. Slobodan Milosevic was the architect of the Croatia and Bosnia wars. And where did he die? In prison. In The Hague on trial. So Putin faces a very difficult situation here. It may make him more reckless, and it's something that should concern all of us. I have so much more to say, but I think I will stop and take your questions. Also happy to talk about Moldova. That's me in Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova. So, please, your question.
When you mentioned the new technology, the armaments that are going to Ukraine to help it, I couldn't help but think of the so-called advisors who went to Vietnam to help there, and I'm wondering who is training the Ukrainians, or maybe they didn't even need training in using these weapons.
So the question is, who's training the Ukrainians? For some of the equipment, particularly that comes from NATO members that were formerly part of the Warsaw Pact, so Poland particularly, the Baltics, they have Soviet equipment, which they're not using, or which has become obsolete for them. But this is the same equipment that the Ukrainians and the Russians have, so the Ukrainians know how to use it. With regard to the high-tech systems, like the HIMARS missiles and so on, the training's taking place not in Ukraine, but in Poland and other NATO countries. And that creates the risk of a possible Russian attack on those countries. I should add something here, which is a word about the Russian tactics. I talked about the threat of a nuclear weapon, but what I should also say is the tactics they are currently using. Winter is approaching in Ukraine, and they have systematically set out to destroy the energy infrastructure, the electrical grid, the gas systems for Ukraine. And so it is a strategy aimed at inflicting maximum pain on the Ukrainian people, but not just on them. They have reduced the flow of gas to Western Europe in the hopes of having European opinion turn against against their governments over Ukraine. And of course, the war in Ukraine is a major source of inflation, not only in Europe, but in this country, by reducing the supply of gas. And the Russians and the lovely Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, got together to reduce gas supplies, petroleum supplies, with the impact of driving up the price after Biden believed he had a commitment from Mohammed bin Salman to increase production. And of course, this seems to have been timed just before the midterms in the United States, which, if you realize, Mohammed bin Salman had a very good relationship with the previous administration. Biden came in and said he wouldn't deal with Mohammed bin Salman. So you can imagine that, again, from his point of view, that he might much prefer to deal with the Republicans. Here.
You mentioned the 200,000 Russians that went AWOL. When I heard that, I was really fascinated and perceived it as a real opportunity. But it seems they were not, based on reporting, that they were not that well received from other countries, which, like I say, I think is very disappointing. And I was wondering if you know any further information about that, and if there's any organization or anything where people can network with people, Russians that had the courage to do that. But also, in this, the younger generations are far more internationally connected thanks to the internet, including young people in Russia. And I can't help but think there has to be some sort of internal dissent going on. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it. And yeah, any perspective on this would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I think your point is exactly right. There is, particularly among the younger generation, a sense of dismay about this. After all, Putin is, 70. Not that I personally think it's that old, but if you're 20 or a teenager, yes, and he's connected back to an era that these kids don't know, and it's not just that they have the internet and TikTok and everything; it's that they travel. They've and if you go to Russia, the Russian cities are. Were prosperous places. They were very Western. So you have to imagine that this has caused considerable dismay there. So I agree with you. In terms of the young men or the men, because they aren't all young, and some of this conscription got some people who are in their 50s. They've gone to a variety of countries which do not require visas for Russians to enter. Kazakhstan probably has the largest number, and there's a significant Russian population in Kazakhstan, and that was pretty easily accessible. Turkey, but you need a flight to get there, and there became concern that the Russian authorities would stop people as they tried to flee, and then to Georgia. There were people who suggested that the Russians should be shunned, including particularly in the Baltics. My view is the same as yours. Welcome them, because you obviously want to encourage as many people to leave and to not support the war as possible. And besides, just like here, if the young men are leaving, well, the young women are also not going to be happy about that. They're remembering back to the Vietnam era, and their parents aren't going to be happy about it. The fact that their sons have, or if they're married, their wives, that their sons have had to leave. So, yeah. Please, over here.
Thank you. Help me understand Iran's participation in the war. We know extremely complex, very sophisticated weapons are now en route to Russia. That means that we have got to counter that, we, the United States and NATO countries. But help me understand Iran's participation in the war. Thank you. There is a bit of a
coalition of the outsiders, the outcasts, and so Iran, which is itself subject to sanctions, is selling drones to the Russians. I imagine that some of this is simply for money. Some of it's to stick the finger into the eye of the United States. I think it's, again, a bit of a price we pay for the rather reckless diplomacy that we took toward Iran, including pulling out of a deal, that the nuclear deal, that the Iranians were honored. We were the ones who broke it. But I think there's a real limit to how much help Iran. So these drones are not super sophisticated, but drone technology has become rather easy to make these days, and so they certainly are helping. They're supplying additional equipment to the Russians. They aren't nearly as good as the Turkish drones that the Ukrainians have, or other equipment. But what these weapons are really being used for, what they're really effective at, is in terrorizing civilians, in hitting apartment blocks, schools, just ordinary civilian targets, knocking out electric grid. You can't move your electric grid. You can move your very sophisticated equipment and so on, but you can't just move the electric grid. So these are weapons that are being used to inflict pain on the Ukrainian people in the hopes of destroying their morale. I think the history of warfare suggests that those tactics almost never work. Let's see. Dart.
Does Putin have any way out?
Yeah.
Does Putin have any way out?
That is the question. I mean, what is the off-ramp for Putin? I think that's the problem he has. He believed that Ukraine would collapse in a very short period of time. He believed that the Ukrainians would welcome the Russians, and none of that's true. And so, how does he believed his military was strong. He was told by all his generals how good his military was. Now what does he do? I think it's very hard for him to go back to February 24th, which would leave him holding Crimea and parts of Luhansk and Donetsk. And it's, the Ukrainians also are full of a belief that they're winning, so they might not accept that. And of course, the sanctions aren't going to be lifted on Russia. So, at this point in time, I think it's very hard to see an off-ramp for Putin. Interestingly, at the beginning of the war, there was a bit of an off-ramp. The Ukrainians, and Zelensky said this, and I have great respect for him, he said, look, the biggest danger is, I don't want to see my people be killed. And so he said, look, we're prepared to talk about Crimea. We're prepared to have a waiting period, 10, 15 years, and then a referendum, which, if that took place, then undoubtedly the Russians would win. But there were offers of compromise. But at that point, of course, Putin believed that he could be in Kiev in a few days. So I don't see the off-ramp. Will there be diplomacy? Yes, at some point. I will say that I think the Progressive Caucus in Congress who signed that letter made a huge mistake, and I was in Zagreb with Speaker Pelosi when that came out, and I can tell you how appalled she was by it. Not because diplomacy is per se wrong, but going public with that is a mistake because it makes diplomacy unacceptable, or it puts it off. Please.
We'll take one more question from the floor, and then we're going to switch to online, because we don't want to forget about our online audience. So we'll take one question from the floor.
What is your estimation of Xi Jinping's use of the diversionary tactic of the Ukraine to take advantage of the opportunities that present itself in Taiwan?
I think I don't see that the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan, so they can ratchet up the pressure. I mean, first, from a military point of view, Taiwan is, well, it's much smaller than, the ratio of sizes is quite different, but it's separated by I don't know, 200 miles of water from China, so it would be quite an amphibious landing. The United States has said it would defend Taiwan, so the risks for China are much greater. So I think sorry, and I think Xi is a more responsible leader than Putin. For one thing, a conflict over Taiwan would destroy China's economy, which is an export-driven economy, and it would be much more devastating than the Ukraine war is than the sanctions are for Russia. So, for all these reasons, I don't see that as happening. I think it might be time to step back and wonder why we are portraying China as an adversary. Because there really isn't that much for us to fight with China about. The South China Sea. They aren't going to put a chain across the South China Sea. It may matter a lot to the Philippines or Vietnam as to who owns those atolls and reefs. But they're rocks in the sea. And if they want to spend billions of dollars putting in airfields, it really doesn't matter. Even if there were oil under them, and there's no evidence that there is, it would have a very minor benefit to the Chinese economy because the economy is so large. So, and I could go on other things. Chinese investment in Africa or building harbors in Sri Lanka. What are they going to do with them? They aren't going to make Africa communist. They aren't communists themselves. They aren't going to settle Chinese there. So what difference does it make? So I think a lot of our approach to China is more alarmist than it need be, and that plays into Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is a real issue. So let's go online.
Thank you. One of the nice things about online questions is they're often very terse. Yeah. So I'm going to bundle because they are so terse. So the first one is, what are the U.S. objectives in the Ukraine war? That's the first one. The second one is, what are the current prospects for peace negotiations? And last, if for any reason Putin exits the stage, wouldn't the like-minded ex-KGB people around him just carry on in the same vein? What are the U.S. objectives? What are the current prospects for peace negotiations? And wouldn't KGB people around him just carry on? Thank you.
Right, let me address the last point first because I've already been talking about it. The KGB people are not necessarily the most hard line. In fact, in many cases, they're the people who understand how the world works. So that association, is it doesn't equate to hard line necessarily. Secondly, I don't believe that the experienced professionals and government people around Putin actually think this is a good idea. I mean, clearly the head of the SVR, Foreign Intelligence, is not an enthusiast. When Putin announced he was putting his nuclear forces on special alert, that this was on television, and you could see the defense minister there. That guy was not jumping up and down. The body language was not thinking this is a great idea. It was quite a reserved response, shall we say. And in fact, although they were on special alert, there was no visible difference in the posture of Russia's nuclear forces. So, and Lavrov, again, he's an experienced diplomat. Does he actually think this was a smart thing to do? I'm not inside his brain, but it's hard for me to think he does. Clearly, I know lots of Russians in their foreign policy establishment who think this is a disaster. I think without Putin, I think you might well have a different approach, especially since the failure in the war is what the factor that would lead to Putin's ouster. In terms of what are the U.S. objectives, I think they're very clear. The U.S. objectives are the end to the war and the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty over its national territory. Although nobody would say this probably at this point, not including Crimea. And sorry, what was the?
A path to negotiations?
Oh, yes, negotiations. At some point, there will have to be negotiations. The position of the United States is very clear that these negotiations have to be led by the Ukrainians. This is not something to be negotiated between the United States and Russia. It is to be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. That said, the United States, as Ukraine's major backer, is going to have some say on the negotiations. And rather separately, there is clearly room for negotiations with the Russians on issues to avoid an escalation of the war and to expansion from Ukraine, and to avoid a situation where we could where it could escalate into something that's going to be catastrophic for the entire planet. And finally, actually, it would be terrific. This war has now gone on for 8 months. It's certainly likely to go on for quite a bit longer. There are other issues that we need to deal with, again, including climate change, but pandemic, economy. And so in some of these issues, we may need to cooperate with the Russians. Next online, is there?
Yeah, I'll give one more online question before I come back to the floor here. It was the Ukrainians are unable to strike at Russia, but Russia is able to strike at Ukraine. Why can't the Ukrainians retaliate on Russian soil?
So if you were doing this as a matter of what might be right or wrong, then you could say if the Russians are attacking Ukraine, the Ukrainians ought to be able to attack Russia. Fair enough. But that's not the only criteria here. Ukrainian attacks on Russia risk a major escalation of the war, that could be damaging to the Ukrainian cause, and never mind the risk that it would pose to the countries that are supporting Ukraine. So I think the United States and others have been very clear that if you wish to have the support and weapon systems, you do not launch attacks into Russia. Now, there have been a few attacks, a few events. It turned out there was a terrible accident from somebody smoking, causing 7 planes to blow up in Crimea. And an oil refinery, again, I think too many smokers in Russia, in Belgorod on the border. But a major attack, no, that has to be off the books. And again, however satisfying, however much might feel the Russians deserve it, this is about trying to accomplish the goal.
You said it's basically improper for the U.S. to butt in to if Ukraine and Zelensky were to sit down and negotiate over land and sovereignty, et cetera, that U.S. to stay out. But what about comment on Henry Kissinger's suggestion back in August, I believe it was, that was summarily dismissed by Zelensky, and Elon Musk made a similar statement that was totally dismissed with an F-bomb by a Ukrainian ambassador. Why not? It would have saved 40 or 60 or 80, whatever it is, 1,000 lives if they had, surrendered or at least sat down back in February. Can you comment on what Ambassador, it was Secretary of State Kissinger suggested?
I think actually, there you have a good point there. There's a need. That there may be a need for a negotiation. There may be a need for a compromise, and it certainly, if the situation went back to February 24th, and you then had a major effort to reconstruct Ukraine, would that be better than continuing the war all the way to the Russian border or into Crimea with all the consequences? That might well be the case if the Ukrainians so decide. So I think the issue is not the negotiations, but that a tweet from Elon Musk was probably not the way to, was certainly not the way to get serious negotiations. Henry Kissinger's point is one to be considered. Let me be diplomatic about it. Please.
Peter, what's your understanding of the flow of intelligence information that the Americans are giving the Ukrainians? They must be watching this on live screen, eyes in the sky, and who knows how much the Americans know what's going on. How much do you think that's getting passed on?
If I knew, I couldn't tell you. But since I don't, I can guess that a lot is being passed on. And again, it goes to the point about not targeting into Russia. You're now getting valuable information on the location of Russian forces that enable you to use the weapons that are being provided. You don't want to do anything that would jeopardize that flow of information. So in that sense, the Americans have huge influence on the actual battlefield. But again, I'm sure if you asked the administration, they would deny that anything like this was going on. And me, I really don't know. There.
Yeah, in September there was a pipeline explosion for the natural gas line, and I'm wondering what is your opinion of who did it, for what purpose, etc.?
Again, I don't know. But the suspicion is that it was the Russians as part of their strategy to make life as difficult as possible for Europe. Something like 33% of Europe's gas comes from Russia. 20% comes from Norway. There is also the large pipeline network that goes from Norway that could also be vulnerable. And there were reports of Russians flying drones over Norwegian facilities. Again, my judgment is that those kind of tactics don't actually work. If you're caught inflicting pain, you tend to cause people to be tougher in their approach. Please.
Through the auspices, I think, of the UN and Turkey, agreement was reached to enable grain to get out of Ukraine, and just lately that's become threatened, I guess, by Russia. What's the prospects of that continuing, and how much at this point, how much grain is sort of left in the country? Is that still a very important issue at this point?
It's a hugely important issue for most of the world because Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of grain. I have to say, when I hadn't really focused on this because the Soviet Union was a big importer of grain. You remember in 1980, after the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter imposed the grain embargo on the Soviet Union. But over time, it's reversed, and they are some of the world's largest exporters. And so this is hugely important in Africa, South Asia, populous and relatively poor parts of the world, which is why Secretary General Guterres brokered this deal to allow export of grain from Odessa. And when I was in Odessa, it was just beginning. I could count 6 ships waiting to take out grain. After the Ukrainians used drone boats to hit Russian ships in the Black Sea, Putin announced he was not going to continue the agreement. But this antagonized Turkey, which is the one NATO country that has not been imposing sanctions on Russia, and whose support Russia needs, or at least whose strong hostility Russia would wish to avoid. And also it was bad news for India, which has declined to impose sanctions or even to vote to condemn what Russia is doing. So I think Putin, having impulsively said he was canceling the deal, he's now said it's back on. Yeah, there's a lot of grain in Ukraine because of these huge, and in Russia, there are these huge grain elevators. A lot of it's been stolen by Russia in the areas where they occupy, and that's another issue. I mean, once this is over, there's going to be the huge question of reparations and settling the debt of reconstruction, war crimes, and that all of that also makes it hard to get a settlement, particularly the issue of war crimes.
Friends, we're coming very close to the conclusion of our evening. I'm going to have one more question from online, and then I'll take one more question from the floor. Online, do you think that Putin may try to use Kaliningrad as a staging military area for attacking the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, through the Suwalki Pass?
No. If he's going to attack the Baltic states, he can do it much more easily from Belarus, or I guess in the case of Estonia, directly. So he doesn't need to do it from Kaliningrad, which is a lousy place to launch an attack because it's surrounded by NATO. So if you attack from there, your whole base is likely to would be very vulnerable. But again, I don't think Russia's going to attack the Baltic states. That would really be something that would bring us close to World War III, and I don't think Putin wants to do that. And I don't think the people in the Russian government would accept that. I think there is a line where they would not allow this to go forward. It even happened again in our country in the final days of the Trump administration. The leaders in the Pentagon and the State Department took steps to make sure that nothing was done reckless at the very end. So,
could you speak briefly to your trip to Moldova and why you were there and what's happening?
So Moldova is probably the single most vulnerable country after Ukraine. And part of, let's see if I can switch over to the map. Part of the reason it's vulnerable is because of Transnistria. Now, the interesting thing about Moldova is that it was part of Romania from 1918 to 1940, when, as part of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was agreed that Russia could take it, or Soviet Union could take it, and it was then became a union republic of the Soviet Union. But prior to 1940, Stalin had created a Moldovan autonomous Soviet republic within Ukraine, which you can see in the map in the middle there, and also, in the map in the middle. And so a little bit of that, most of that land was returned to Ukraine, but a little bit of it was attached on the other side of the Dniester River, hence Transnistria. When the Soviet Union broke up, Moldova itself is like 90% Romanian, ethnic Romanians. But Transnistria was 2/3 Slavs, Russians and Ukrainians. And so there was a breakaway state that has existed for 30 years, unrecognized, called Transnistria, with Russian troops there as peacekeepers. And at one point they really were peacekeepers. So the dilemma, now that state, of course, has Ukraine on the other side. And so at the moment it's also in a precarious position. So the issue is whether the Russians who support Transnistria might take action against either in Transnistria, but the real risk to Moldova would be if Russia succeeded in Ukraine. If they took, particularly if they took Odessa, that would put Moldova at great risk. And so one option I think the Moldovans have is to think, do you really want to keep Transnistria? Again, this is not historic part of Moldova, and it was not. It's not about a third of the population was Romanian speaking in 1989, but it's much less now. I mean, sometimes holding on to additional territory is a source of trouble. Again, the issue doesn't arise at the moment because the Russians have not been successful in Ukraine. But there's no question that Moldova is very vulnerable at the moment. It is generally vulnerable. It's also vulnerable economically because Russia has cut off gas supplies, including supplies that power the grid in Moldova. And Ukraine is no longer supplying electricity to Moldova because Russia's been attacking the Ukrainian grid. So for electricity, Moldova is now, they've been reorienting to get electricity from Romania. And then there's the question of what is Moldova's long-term relationship with Romania? Mayu Sandu, well, first, all Moldovans are eligible for Romanian citizenship. And I think almost all of them get it. Why? Because that makes them EU citizens. And Mayu Sandu, the president of Romania, of Moldova, is also talked about as a possible presidential candidate in Romania. So, you know, in normal circumstances, you know, Moldova probably would not like to be the poorest and most remote province of Romania. But in other circumstances where Moldova is feeling very threatened, that is a potential home.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. That's the end of our Q&A.